So what I wanted to do with this little presentation is talk to you about birth, death and marriage records in Ireland. Now I'm talking about the civil records, or what in America you call vital records, and I think in Canada you call them vital statistics, but I'm talking about the official state records of births, deaths and marriages. Before I do that, I want to very quickly point out that Irish genealogy is something where it can be useful to have a subscription to some of the big sites. And I'm sure that you already have a subscription to some of the sites. And I just wanted to very quickly run you through on Ancestry. To access the records that they have for Ireland, you need the World Explorer package. And it costs $40 a month, or €37 or £33. Your subscription rolls over. But if you've never had a subscription to Ancestry, you can have a free trial for 2 weeks. Just make sure to cancel it. Find My Past is a site where you might not have used it as much in America and Canada, but there are a lot of Irish records on Find My Past. And of course, there is overlap between these two sites. And you always should be looking at Family Search too, but I just specifically wanted to point out the subscription ones first. Find My Past is a little bit cheaper. The equivalent world package costs €23, or actually it's cheaper in euro for some reason, but it's dearer in dollars. It's 43 there. And they also have a 2-week free trial. The other site, which you may not have heard of, is an Irish subscription site called Roots Ireland. And they actually offer a 1-day subscription for €15. So it's very small amount of money to have a look at it and see if it's what you want. But in all 3 cases, you can register a free account without subscribing, and you can have a look at what material they have. And you always want to know that the area you're interested in is covered and the time period you're interested in is covered before you buy a subscription. I'm mentioning that because a lot of the civil records, there are indexes on some of the sites, and some of them are better indexes than others, but they are all an identical index, and I will get to that in a second. So let me tell you just a tiny bit about the history of civil registration in Ireland. All birth, deaths and marriage registration had developed as part of a larger Victorian healthcare system used in Britain, and it began there in 1837. The system that we have in Ireland largely follows the same model as it does in England and Wales. Scotland's a little bit different. Despite the plans from the start for them to extend this civil registration system to Ireland, it took almost 9 years for it to happen. And when it began, it only began on a very limited basis with the registration of non-Catholic marriages in April 1845. Now, the reason that it took a while to get going and it started in this limited fashion is that the Catholic Church didn't want to help out. They thought this was interference from the government in what were spiritual matters, and they said, get out, we're not interested in helping you register this stuff. And so it took another almost 20 years before general registration of every birth, death and marriage was supposed to begin from January 1864. And of course, in between that period, we had the famine. We tend to in Ireland call it the famine, capital T, capital F, and we don't really say the word potato when we reference it. And we also call it the Great Famine, because of course it wasn't the only famine that happened in Ireland. So in the 1851 census, of which very little survives, they actually asked people who died in your family since the last census in 1841 and what did they die of. And they used the phrase, this is owing to a lack of civil registration records that we're asking you this, because they were lobbying for it all this time. So finally it got going in 1864. And they used a system based on the poor law districts. Now, the poor law union was something that also was part of this Victorian healthcare system, and it was a way to help people who were destitute. You probably have heard the term workhouse. So every union in the country, and there were many, many unions. I have here a poster on my wall behind me of all the poor law unions in Ireland. There's 168 of them. And some of them are confusingly the same name as a county name. But if you search for them, the county name it's not going to cover the entire county. It's only going to cover that particular district. In common parlance, we call them registration districts, but their official name is Superintendent's Registration District. So they're the same as the poor law unions. Now, don't worry if you're a bit confused by that. I'm going to explain it all. The early records were actually handwritten, and they compiled an index alphabetically every year. And at the end of the year, they would put them all together in a book, and they would publish the book. But what they found as they started to use these records is that they needed the information more often than once a year. So they divided the year into 4 quarters from 1878 onwards. And so the year had, now this is not, in the way we search on the internet now, this is not particularly relevant, but it is important to know how the context developed of these things. So if you were searching a physical book of the indexes, if it was before 1878, you would have a book and it would be an alphabetical list of everything for the whole year of births. And you would just look up the name you were interested in and go from there. But after 1878, you would have to look in 5 places in the book, one for each quarter of the year, which ended in March and June and September and December, and then one at the very end of the book for late registrations. So you can imagine a baby is born in the week after Christmas. Their parents aren't in a hurry to get to the registration office and register that child's birth. They're celebrating Christmas and they've got a new baby, and maybe they don't get to do it until the middle of January. So that baby's birth in the indexes is going to be in the wrong year. If that baby was born in 1879, he's going to be registered in 1880. But of course, when you get the information, it's still going to say the correct date of birth, but the index shows for the next year. So, and that's similar. If someone was born at the end of March, they're probably going to be registered in the next quarter, and so on. So it's just to know that that was the way it does. Nowadays, we're looking up these records on a computer. We're not ever really having to look at a book or a microfilm anymore. So you're just putting the name in and the year and you're looking for it. But the registration year is still important. So again, even if you're putting the name in, you still have to think, oh, maybe they were born at the end of the year. So you always want to do a couple of years either side. And of course, people are not always precise about their ages, as we know. So you might not be totally sure if they were sure about how old they were. It's hard for us to imagine today, but people they didn't have to be precise about these things in the past. And so they might say, oh, I'm about 40, when in fact they were 43 or 37. Now, people were obliged by law to register these life events, and they were fined for not doing it. But it's still the case that in the first sort of 15 years of this system bedding in, there would be lots of people who they didn't get registered. Their births weren't registered, their deaths in particular weren't registered. And marriages, they tend to be a bit more precise because there's more than one person involved, and the church was also involved in registering the marriage. So if you don't find someone in these civil records in these early years, you have to consider that maybe their record was never registered. But we say generally by about 1880, we should see good coverage. But I have found people as recent as the 1890s who weren't registered with their birth. And my own grandfather, who was only born in 1922, turns out his birth wasn't registered. And he only discovered this when he tried to claim his old age pension at the age of 66. And they said, we don't know who you are. And he'd gone the whole way through his life without a birth certificate. He had a baptismal record, and that seemed to be enough. He was even in the army. I don't know how he got away with it. So his sister had to go and swear an affidavit that he was born when he said he was born. She was older than him. And then he got his birth registered retrospectively. So if I look for him in the indexes, he's not there. But if I went in to the General Register Office in Ireland and looked at the book for that year, he would be in there because they would have reprinted it subsequently and put him back in the index. So there's a lot of indexes online, and you may be familiar with these indexes. There's copies of the indexes on Family Search, on Ancestry, and on Find My Past. And those 3 are identical data sets. The Mormons came to Ireland in the 50s. They microfilmed all of the birth, death, and marriage records. And what they microfilmed then became the indexes. Later on, they sold that index to Ancestry and Find My Past. So they are, or should be, identical. But of course, as records get transcribed and then digitized, we know that little mistakes can creep in. So you do see little tiny differences. But broadly speaking, you're going to get the indexes from 1845 for marriages and from 1864 for births and deaths, right up to 1958 on those 3 sites. But they are just indexes. You can still do a lot with indexes, but they're not going to give you the full records. But on irishgenealogy.ie, which is a state-run free site that you don't need any login for, you can access the historic registers for births, deaths, and marriages. And these records go from 1845 for marriage to 1946. They add an extra year on every year, but they are subject to data protection parameters. So there are no births that are under 100 years, there are no deaths that are under 50 years, and there are no marriages that are under 75 years. So you can see that you need to use both the indexes and what's on irishgenealogy.ie to get your best coverage of what's available to you online. And of course, if it's not online, if it's after those dates, those records are still accessible, but you're going to have to contact the General Register Office in Ireland to commission searches and order records. So say, for example, you've got a grandparent who was born in Ireland in the 1920s. You may be able to find an index reference that you think is the right person. And then you can email, I've got it there on the screen, georesearchroom@welfare.ie, and say, I'm looking for this person. You give them all the information they've got. And I think that they were born in 1926. And they will do a search, a 5-year search. So you'd put 1926 as the middle year of that and say, go from 1924 to 1928. And they will turn up anybody in the particular place that you're interested with that right name. And that search will only cost €5. And then you can say, okay, I think this particular person on the list is the right person, and you can order that certificate. And that's going to cost €5. It's just a copy. It's not a legal document, which is why it's cheap, but that's good news for us. So even if you wanted to get the birth, marriage, or death certificate of someone who's alive now, you can use that system. During the pandemic, my sister-in-law needed an extra copy of their baby's birth certificate, but it didn't need to be a legal copy. And I said to her, we'll just email them, give them the details. And they, within 20 minutes, emailed her back a copy of the child's birth record. So there's a lot that can be done online, but it is difficult to get to grips with this system. So I want to show you a couple of things. I'm going to switch my screen. Hopefully it will let me swap what I'm sharing. I'm going to stop it and I'm going to start it again. Sometimes this I find is a little buggy. Okay. So we're going to have a quick look at the indexes here. I'm already logged into Family Search, and we're going to go to Records. Now, if you know the collection title, you can type it in there, but I usually like to use the map. So I click on the map, click on Ireland, and it brings up the list of all the Ireland collections, and it shows the ones, it just shows a random selection. I think they're just in alphabetical order. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go to this one. You see this one here? Ireland Civil Registration Indexes, 1845 to 1958. That's the one we're interested in. And I'm going to search for the name of someone. Now, this person is a sister of my great-grandfather. And she was born Vanna. Now, I've deliberately picked a name that's not very common so that it's not going to bring up too many results here. Of course, you might not always be that lucky. So what I've got here is the one I'm interested in. It's the birth of someone called Georgina Walters, who was born in the last quarter. You see October to December 1891. And it says that her birthplace was Dublin North. So Dublin North is one of the registration districts for Dublin. There are many registration districts for Dublin, but if you put in on Family Search, if you put in Dublin, it will only bring up Dublin North and Dublin South. But that's okay in this instance. And here it just gives me a volume number. But if you go down the page, if you actually view the record, which is weirdly off the screen, you will see there should be giving me a page number. It disappeared. Where's it gone? There it is there. So there's also a page number. And this page number is an important part of the index reference. I don't quite know why Family Search have reordered it like that, but they have. Now, let me go across to this side. That's just the index. It doesn't give me anything else than the index details. Let me go on to irishgenealogy.ie and do the same search. Now here, when you type in a place, it starts to come up with options for you. And these are all registration districts. So if you don't know where someone lived in Dublin, you can just select Dublin. It's going to give you all the options. And here, what I usually do is I usually do a range of years, because you don't always know precisely how old someone was. Sorry, bad typing. And I've ticked birth. If I wanted a more general search, I would obviously not tick birth. Now, this website likes to ask you to prove you're not a robot by doing a CAPTCHA. Sometimes it actually comes up with a CAPTCHA, sometimes you just tick the box. And then it asks you to sign this little administrative box that means absolutely nothing. You can type Mickey Mouse into this box, it does not matter. I just type random letters from the keyboard and I tick the box. That's it. They had to do it for legislation reasons to allow this to be available online. And it gives me a list. In this case, it's the only one on the list. Now, there's a little bit of a difference on this site, is that they have started changing the format of the references. So on this site, they use a group registration ID, whereas on the Family Search site, we saw that there was a year, a quarter of a year, a registration district, a volume, and a page number. Now, those older style references still work when you're ordering something from them. But when you go to this site, they've done it, they've given everything a unique identifier, basically. So let's click on this. And it brings up the same information again. And the reason they do this is that in some periods, the information given in the index was different. But we can click on an image. And this is actually a page from the birth register. Now, you always get 12 names, 10 or 12 names on the page. So you've got to look down and look for the person you're interested in. And this is my person here. So I'm going to go back to my slideshow. Hopefully it will let me move on to it. Can you just give me a nod if you've seen my change of slide? Yeah, great. Okay, so this is what we're going to get on the birth certificate, and then we'll look at it. I have it blown up as well. So we're going to get the name and the gender of the child. We're going to get the date and the place of birth and the name of both parents, and that's going to include the mother's maiden name or her birth name. At this point in history, it's going to say the address of the father and his occupation. And then we get the signature, qualification, and address of the informant. Now, qualification means how do they know that this thing has happened? So it might say mother, or it might say nurse, or it might be a hospital occupier, and then the date of the registration of the birth. So there's quite a lot of information on it. And here is Georgina's birth. You can see it's exactly the same information that I just pulled up on the other screen, but this is one I ordered earlier. So it has the top gathered together with the line. And it tells me that she was born the 9th of September, 1891 at 26 Avondale Avenue. Now, it doesn't tell you where that is in Dublin. You wouldn't necessarily know where number 3 North City is, but I know from personal knowledge that that is in an area of Dublin called Phibsborough. It says her name was Georgina. She was a girl. Her dad was George Walters of the same address, and her mother was Mary Ann Walters, formerly Ure, which is a Scottish name. And her dad was a brass finisher. And it says that her mother registered the birth on the 3rd of November. So quite a long time after Georgina was born. The other thing to note here is that Mary Walters wasn't able to read and write. You can see here, it's a little bit vague, but it says her mark. And that's what it always noted on a civil record if the person was illiterate. So this is what we get on a birth certificate in the past. The only time that that varies is if you get twins or triplets or multiple births of any kind. You get the same information, but they put in a time of birth. So you see here the births of William and James O'Reilly, and they were born on the 4th of September, the 14th of September. And one of them was born at 1 a.m. and one of them was born at 2 a.m. And the reason they put in those times, of course, is to establish who is the elder for inheritance purposes, if necessary. Nowadays, a time of birth would be included as standard on a birth certificate, but they only get it on multiple births in the past. So that's what's on a birth record. I should say that if a child was born outside of marriage, the father's name might not be on the birth certificate. Now, they could still put the father's name down, but after 1881, there was a requirement that if a couple was unmarried, both of them had to go together to register the birth if the father's name was to be put on it. So that leads to a lot of blank father's boxes when the child is born outside marriage. Another issue that you get with birth records is that sometimes children are recorded with no first name. I talked about this in our last session. Sometimes they're down as unknown, and it's because they were born in a hospital and the hospital was, quite frankly, lazy about registering births. And so they would just put down unknown O'Reilly child, and you would have to figure out that that was your unknown Riley child. So if you're not finding someone and you think that they should have a birth record, try just try the box, leaving the first name box blank, and just put the surname in, and then go through the list that you get and go for anything that says unknown and open it and see if you can figure out if that's what you're looking for. All right, so let us go on to have a look at what's on a marriage certificate in Ireland. I know I'm whizzing through this a little bit, but there'll be more detail as we go along. So on a marriage certificate is one of the most useful records for genealogy because, of course, we get the names of multiple generations. We get the date and the place of the marriage, the names of both parties and their father's names, their occupations and their father's occupations, and the address and the marital status of both parties, as well as their age and 2 witnesses who witnessed the marriage. From 1956, we started adding in the mother's names in Ireland, the dates of birth for the bride and groom, as opposed to them just saying, I'm 22, and then their intended future residence, which is nice because you can take those records forward. I'll show you in a minute what it's like to use these records on Family Search and on Irish Genealogy, but let's first look at a copy of a marriage certificate. And we're working here with the same family. This is the parents of Georgina, who we just saw. So this record is from 1874, and it says that the marriage took place at St. Mary's Church in the parish of St. Mary in the city of Dublin. And this church was a Church of Ireland parish. And you can see here, it says married in the Parish Church of Ireland according to the rites and ceremonies of the Church of Ireland after banns. Banns means that the notice of the marriage was read out on 3 consecutive Sundays at a church service. This was to stop fraudulent marriages. You know, if you knew Susan and George were getting married, but hey, Susan's already married to someone, well, then there was plenty of time for you to go and notify the local clergyman that Susan was already married and she couldn't possibly be getting married to George next week. We get the date of the marriage, 5th of April, 1874, and we get the names of the bride and the groom. Now, their age is down as full. That actually just means that they were 21 years or over. In fact, Marianne was about 17, as far as I can tell. She was not in any way 21. And their condition means what is their marital status at the moment. And what we're going to see here is either bachelor and spinster for people who were never married, or you're going to see widow or widower for people who were married and their spouse died. Divorce was not legal in Ireland at this point. In fact, it wasn't legal in Ireland until 1996. So you're never going to see divorced there. For profession or rank, we're going to see brass finisher here for George, and Marianne does not have an occupation, but of course many women did, and if they did, it's going to be recorded there. And then we get their addresses. And so she lived in Phibsborough, and he lived in the city centre on what is today known as Parnell Street. Many streets were renamed in urban areas in Dublin and in other urban areas of the country after independence in 1922, and this is one of them. So the clue is always, if the name of the street is someone who was some sort of figure in Irish independence, like Daniel O'Connell or Charles Stewart Parnell, the chances are it had a different name before independence. We get the names of their fathers, Robert Walters and Alexander Ure, and the occupations of the father. Now, sometimes it will have no occupation there. And that might be an indicator that the person is dead. And sometimes they put the word dead down as their occupation, which is very helpful. They actually were supposed to say whether the father was alive or dead, but in practice they didn't always. But if you see dead on one of them and nothing written on the other, well, then the inference is, of course, that one of them is alive. But even that's not hard and fast, I find. So all you're taking from that is the dad's name and not whether he's alive or dead. And here we get the names of the bride and groom where they would have signed. And this is, of course, a copy. It's not their original handwriting. And then the names of their witnesses, who are Robert White and Alexander Ure. So he might be her father, but he might be also a brother of the same name. And she did, in fact, have a brother of the same name. And there's just no way to tell which of them he was. So let me go back to my screen here. Hopefully you can still see where I've changed. So what's great about Irish genealogy when it comes to marriages is that you don't have to have both names of the couple. So if I say I just want to see everyone called George Walters who ever got married in Dublin, it will give me a list. There's not very many people there. And in fact, all of these people, several of these people are part of my family. So if you know that George Walters married someone called Mary, but you don't know what Mary's birth surname was, this is a great way to find it. If you have no idea who George Walters married, but you already know his father's name, well, then again, you can look at this list, you can open it, and you can figure out where you're going. So here's George, and you see that they have linked them together. On Family Search, it does not link them together. So on Family Search, you would have to conduct 2 separate searches for George Walters and anyone called Mary Ure, and then make sure that the index references matched, which is why it is much more successful to search on this website for marriages. The only difference is that the marriages here only go up to 1946. You get an extra 12 years of index records. And a good rule of thumb is if the index records match, the chances are that couple were married to each other, because unless you've got an extremely common name, like say Patrick Murphy, you'd be really unlucky if there was more than one person on the same page of the marriage register who had the same name. And we can see here that this is exactly what we just looked at, but there's actually 4 couples on the page. So there's George and Marianne, and then there are other couples on this page who married at the same time in that same church. The handwriting is very variable on these, I should warn you. Okay, so let's have a quick whiz at death certificates. Death certificates, unlike marriage and birth certificates, are less helpful for genealogy at this time in Ireland because the information is open to being wrong. The person who's died is not going to sit up and go, hey, that's not how old I am. That's not my job. And it didn't ask for any qualifying information in terms of who their spouse was or anything like that. So this is open for, people not being right about ages and so on. We get the name and the gender of the person. We get the place of death and their age on their last birthday. But again, who knows? Their marital status, their occupation, and their cause of death. And then we get the name and the person who's registering the death and how they know the death has taken place. So most often that will say present at death, and then the date of registration. And so this then is a death certificate. And I'm sorry to say that this is George's death certificate. And he died quite young. He died on the 8th of September, 1891. And we get here his name, his marital status. He was only 40. And he was a brass finisher, so I know it's the same guy. And what it says here in the box is a little bit hard to read, but it says cardiac disease, 6 months, congestion of the lungs, 2 days, and then it says certified. That certified means that a doctor saw him. You don't always get that. What's happened here is brass finishers worked with metal shavings, and they didn't wear masks like we would today when they're doing that. So they often inhaled tiny little metal shards into their lungs, and they often died young of these problems. It's terrible to think. And the person who's registered his death is Alexander Ure, present at death, but he has a different address. And he has registered the death on the 9th of September, the day after the death took place. But if you noticed earlier on, and I'll just whiz back to it to show you, Georgina was born on the 9th of September. So she was born the day after her father died, and that's probably why she was named Georgina. Although inexplicably later in life, she called herself Dorothy. And so what's happened here, presumably, is that Alexander, who is in fact the father-in-law of this man, has gone to register his son-in-law's death. And by the time he's come back, he's found that he has a new granddaughter as well. And he didn't turn around and go back and register her birth straight away. They left it a while. Obviously, it was a huge shock, I can imagine. And the family moved in with him afterwards. So you can see by just looking at 3 copies, 3 records, how much information we can get from them. I knew nothing of this story of George dying young when I came to find him. And I particularly chose his death to show you because of this. His name was Walters, Walters, but you can see that the person who's written this has crossed the L and the T. And he's misindexed as Waters with 2 T's in the indexes. So it took me years to find him because I didn't think of that error that was possible. Now I do. But it was only by finding a partial record that I thought, oh, maybe that's him. And, so you should always consider a transcription error in the index. But in this case, I think it's an entirely reasonable transcription error. If you didn't know that that person's name was Walters, you never would have read that as Walters. So that's a death certificate. Now, I mentioned that we'll be looking at most of these records on either indexes on Family Search or Find My Past or Ancestry, or we'll be looking at the original, or the copies of the registers on irishgenealogy.ie. But there are times, of course, that you need to approach the General Register Office and get something from them that is not available online. And I'm thinking here, people who were born in the first half of the 20th century, where the records are not available easily, or there are early death records that are not online yet. The earliest from 1864 to 1870 have not yet been put online. And those records are, of course, terribly important because they're the earliest death records in the country that exist. And those people could easily have been born in the 18th century. They do claim that they're putting them up, but they haven't done it yet. So if you are needing to order something, this is how you do it. You order it from this email. You give them all the information that you have. You can commission a search for a 5-year period, or you can just say straight up, I need this record if you've already got the index. They send you a payment link to pay with your credit card. And then after the payment, they email the results. They're actually really speedy about this. The turnaround time would be less than an hour for you. So it's really handy if you need something that's not available. Now, you might be wondering about Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is the 6 counties of the island of Ireland that are part of the United Kingdom still. And the rest of it is the Republic of Ireland, where there are 26 counties. Now, there is a different website to use for Northern Ireland records, but you only need to use it for after 1922. So if you have someone who was born in the north, again, in that, say that like from 1922 to 1950, something like that, that you're interested in, then you would go to their website to get the information. But if it is pre-partition, pre-1922, all of the records for the whole island are free on irishgenealogy.ie. And the records that are on the other sites, the index records, cover all of Ireland up to 1922, and then they have a gap where they don't have Northern Ireland from 1922 to 1958. So the other difference is that this website in Northern Ireland, you have to pay for the records, whereas it is free on irishgenealogy.ie. So you always want to try and exploit the free resources before you resort to the not free resources. That is a very speedy version of what I wanted to tell you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and we can see if anyone's got any questions. I see Lynn mentioning that she loves Find My Past. Yeah, Find My Past is really good for Irish records. If you haven't looked at it before, I definitely think it's worth your while doing the free trial. But just make sure you set a reminder on your phone or in your Outlook to cancel it before it charges you money, unless you want to be charged, of course. Okay, does anyone have any questions, or have I just told you everything you don't need to know anything now? You can just jump right in or raise your hand or put something in the chat. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Ed.
All right. I think that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. I think that overview and that getting us used to the sites that really work for Irish genealogy was the very, very best thing we could do for kicking off our updates in the Irish studies. So thank you so much. I think we're going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Sure.